Well, I wanted to cover something today that is, I think, a good thing to cover occasionally, but it's actually something I think in many ways you all do quite well, but also something that we could improve in. I wrote last week, whenever I sent out the announcements, I wrote a little bit about, even though we're familiar with our physical family, we have couples or we have married couples with children, or some of you who are single, you're familiar with who you have in your family. But I ask, can we be more familiar with our brethren at church? Can we be more familiar? Now again, I think you all are pretty familiar with each other. And yet, there may be areas that we could improve as well. Can we use the time that we spend here at services before and afterwards in a more productive way by more attentively learning about other people's lives? What type of thoughtful questions might we ask of others to be better acquainted with them personally? That's really the focus of what I want to mention here today. I am grateful for all of you, and I know that all of you, I have been coming up here to Fulton and here to Kingdom City for a dozen years at least or more. And so I'm kind of familiar with you. I know where most of you live. I'm aware of a few things about you, about Tom and the sandwich. I know very little about some of you. I know a little more about some of the others of you. I know things that you have gone through that I've been either aware of or involved with or praying about. And yet, and we find this in many of our congregations today, we've been together for a long time. Those of you who have been a part of the Church of God for decades, we know other people, at least we get together with them at church. And I was thinking that, of course, I'm familiar, having been here for a dozen years. Pat and I have been in Kansas City for 35 years, it seems, amazingly. That it's been 35 years that we've been there. We've been in that area. We know the people there. And before that, we were in Lake Ozark for the decade before that. So we know most of the people in mid-Missouri. Only, we know who they might be. We know what their name is and have seen or talked to them quite a bit. And so we know a little bit about each other. And it's always, as I try to remind you, it's a delight for me to come up here. It's not a difficulty for me to come up here. I'm thankful to be able to come up here, glad to be able to be here. And yet, there are two things I want to point out. One of them is a clear reality about our relationship being all of us here in this congregation. The Fulton, Columbia, Kingdom City congregation. Some of you are advertising we're a Kingdom City congregation at the feast. So, that's where we meet, yes, physically. But see, the first thing just deals with the fact that, we often speak of our local congregation and even of our whole church congregation as our spiritual family, our church family. And of course that is locally and then collectively as far as what we know about and pray about and we get updates about. Appreciate Tom bringing up the council. Thank you for your prayers about that. I sent what the report they send us to you. If you read through it, you could see what it was they discussed and what they decided in some cases, and then other things are not included in that. But we're collectively wanting to be aware that we are a spiritual family, and that we are not just here in the United States, but around the world. Even as we mentioned, people in the Philippines and in other places in Africa. And whenever you look at feast sites, we apparently have over 60 that we had last year, and that we probably are going to have about that many this year. But it's important for us to think about God having drawn us to be a part of the Church of God, and for us to think of ourselves as a church family, our spiritual family. Here in 1 Peter 4, it directly tells us several things here. We might start in 1 Peter 4, starting, up in verse 16. Yet if any of you suffer as a Christian, don't consider it a disgrace, but glorify God because you bear His name. We just sang a song about bearing the name of God, being a part of a spiritual family. And the better we understand how that God is causing us to grow as a spiritual child of His. He started that spiritual development through giving us His Spirit, begetting us with that Spirit, and we are expected then to grow, and ultimately we are to be born. That whole idea about begettal and then growing and then being born applies spiritually. And it clearly is a part of what we believe and what we teach. And here it mentions, that we are to glorify God because we bear His name. And in verse 17, for the time has come for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begin with us, then what will be the end of those who don't obey the gospel of God? See, that statement we often read in talking about judgment is upon us today, because it is. We need to understand that. Yes, God works with people in order that He creates. Some of us have an awareness of that before Christ returns. Most of the world is going to have an awareness of that when Christ returns and then thereafter. That's just a fact. And so we can say, oh, well, aren't we special? No. We're just the beginning. We're just the start of what God is actually doing in growing His spiritual family. But as this verse in verse 17 says, the time has come for judgment to begin with the household of God. See, that's a description of the Church of God, a description of our fellowship, if we want to call it that, the United Church of God, and of our local grouping. That's a description, the household of God. And certainly the common denominator that we have with each other is God's Spirit. God is the common denominator. We are all to be learning to be like our elder brother. We are all to be growing up to the fullness of the stature of Christ. We have that common denominator of God calling us. Whether He called us when we were, wherever we might have lived at the time. I grew up in Oklahoma. My wife grew up in Oklahoma as well. We were pretty young whenever God drew us into the church, drew us to be aware of the church, and then eventually to be a part of the church. But other people some of you were in Missouri, in southern parts of Missouri, or even Kentucky, or I don't know where all the rest of you were. Many of you were perhaps, some of you might have been in Pennsylvania, I guess. I can't guess about everybody here, but don't know about Dan over there. I'm going to have to check on him. But anyway, Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a good place. But see, God drew us out of different settings. I was a very backward. Not that I'm not that much backward now, but I was very backward then. Farm kid. I knew a little bit about livestock. I knew a little bit about pigs and cattle and sheep and horses and about growing wheat and baling hay. I mean, that's what I knew. That's what I grew up with. And my wife grew up in a similar, about a mile away, an hour away in Oklahoma in a small town setting, mostly within a, more of a, you could say, urban, as opposed to rural, my rural setting, her urban setting, very small town, but a different background altogether. And yet a common denominator for us and for all of us is God granting us His Spirit, causing us to be a part of as we read, the household of God. And we could also look at another verse here in the book of Galatians, chapter 6. Paul is concluding the book of Galatians with a number of admonitions. He says in verse let's back up to verses 9. Galatians 6, verse 9. So let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap at harvest time if we don't give up. And so all of us, understand we need to endure unto the end. We need to finish the race. We need to, allow God to do His work in our lives. So, in verse 10 then, whenever we have opportunity, let us work for the good of all, but especially work for the good of the household of faith. The household of faith. So we're called the household of God. We're called the household or family of faith. And see, that's what unites us. That's what brings us together. I think it's unique to see in the books, the little epistles of the Apostle John. Let's look at John, 3rd John. Don't need to give you a chapter because there's only one. But in 3rd John, you see, and I think you probably have been taught and by reading that John wrote about love. He wrote about what love really is and how it is. It's described in other places, but John is often called the apostle of love. But see, John had a unique, in a sense, opportunity because he was not only among the original apostles, but then he would live through later the death of Peter, the death of Paul, the scattering all the other apostles, probably James, I assume, James being the half-brother of Jesus. He would live into the 90s or close to 100. He would have plenty of opportunity to know the brethren, at least the ones he would be in contact with. And I know he was in Ephesus for a long time. I'm not sure about the other locations. He had to be in Jerusalem for quite a while as well. But here in 3rd John, you see him talking kind of about 3 different things here in this little book. But I want to just read what he says about Gaius. Gaius apparently was a member of the church. He's mentioned a couple of times, maybe common name, could be referring to different people, I don't know. But here in verse 1 it says, the elder, talking about himself, John, as an apostle, the oldest, last remaining apostle, the elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. See, that's in a sense revealing. He not only knew who Gaius was, he knew quite a bit about Gaius. He was loved by John. Gaius apparently, was a church member that John was close to. He was familiar with. He knew about him. And he says, "Beloved," in verse 2, "I pray that all may go well with you, and that you may be in good health, just as it is well with your soul. I was overjoyed when some of the brethren arrived and testified to your faithfulness in the truth, namely how you walk in truth." And so, of course, John was impressed, not only with Gaius as a friend, someone he loved, but someone he understood to be faithful. Faithful to God, faithful to the Word of God, to the truth of God. He says in verse 4, "I have no greater joy than this, to hear that my children are walking in the truth." See, that was something that John was delighted to hear, that he was having this reported to them. So, however I get reports from whomever, you don't need to worry about them. They're all good reports. That's something that John apparently was aware of. He goes on in verse 5, "Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren, even though they are strangers to you. They have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on in a manner worthy of God, for they began their journey for the sake of Christ, accepting no support from non-believers. Therefore, we ought to support such people so that we may become co-workers, or that we all would become co-workers with the truth." See, this is just a description of a connection that John had with Gaius. He goes actually ahead to talk about Diotrephes and Demetrius, but we won't read about them. One of those he commended and the other he condemned in a sense. But he starts his little letter, in a personal letter as it is, to the beloved Gaius. And so, again, it's consistent with the things that we've already mentioned from Peter or from Paul, that John too understood that the grouping of the people who are called out to be a part of the church are a household of God, a household of faith, and that faith is to be promoted, and that they were to grow in knowing one another and loving one another. And verse 8 says, "Therefore we ought to support such people so that we may become co-workers with the truth." So that is the first thing I want to mention, and I think that in a sense it's kind of self-evident, and we talk about that at times, that we're all a part of, say, God's family. But we need to think about that, even with our potential amendment to our fundamental beliefs regarding marriage. That it seems to be a very primary thing to me, and probably should be a part of what we promote, of greater significance and importance than maybe other things. But that's something that we are working on. So, as we recognize, we are a household of faith. We are a church family, a spiritual family, a spiritual grouping. So we might think about, what makes a grouping like ours strong? What can we do to make it strong? Well, we can show up for church. Yeah, that's the first thing. Coming together, serving one another, helping one another, being aware of needs. Those are all things that would fall into that category. You might think about a strong family. What are things that a strong family does? Well, physically, a strong family spends time together. They spend quality and quantity time together. A strong family will put family first before outside commitments or even other relationships. A strong family supports everyone in the family where they need support. A strong family will stand with each other through thick and thin. Those are things you can easily read about. What makes a good family or a strong family. It's always based on the marriage commitment of the parents, but strong family has those things going for it. So how can we do? This is the point of what I want to mention here today. How can we do these things in our spiritual family right here in Fulton? How can we do these things? I might read a couple of other verses here. Actually, this was referred to earlier in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. It points out how that we all actually need each other. Ecclesiastes 4 verse 9 says, 2 are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if one fall, then another will lift up the other. But woe to one who is alone and falls and doesn't have another to help. You know, that occurs within our families and within our marriages. And we need to be able to pick each other up or help each other. It would apply even beyond that to our grouping here. You know, people who are scattered, you know, up into Troy or into Middleton. I think that's where the parishes live. I see different addresses for them, so I don't know. I know they're in the same place, but in Ashland City or in Fulton or down outside of Russellville or even Holt Summit, wherever that is, Hank. I know it's down 54. See, these are places that are separated, but you know, we need to, you know, recognize that if we are together and then we're able to help each other, that's a good thing. That's what God says to do. And even we might look at Proverbs chapter 18. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 14. Verse 24. Proverbs 18, verse 24, it says in the New King James, a man who has friends must show himself friendly, but there is a friend that sticks closer than a brother. A man who has friends must show himself friendly. So we have a responsibility to try to cultivate that among ourselves. And then it points out, of course, a friend that sticks closer than a brother. You know, that could be referring to, well, it's not just our physical family that we should be concerned about, but each other. We can do that here locally. And we do these things. Of course, some of the other translations of that verse, verse 18, says some friends play at friendship, but a true friend sticks closer than one's nearest kin. And that has a little different connotation, and yet it still is also talking about how it is that we can, you know, be closer together. So, you know, how can we do this? What should we do? Well, of course, we share prayer requests. We do that on a kind of church-wide basis in some cases. Often things that are very significant or serious that people are going through. Other times we often have local things that we're sharing and we know about for each other, and even that we know about with people in Kansas City from here. I know some of you are very good about texting each other and keeping up on everything, and you can figure out, you know, whether I've got misinformation out about when we're meeting church, you know, whether it's 10 o'clock or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or not at all, or canceled. Those are things, you know, that we can easily do. Of course, we write notes and letters back and forth. You know, those we often share addresses so that can be done. But another way that we could do that is just when we come together, our Sabbath conversations can cultivate better knowledge of each other, better knowledge of some personal things, not every personal thing, but at least some personal things about others that are kind of interesting to know. A physical family, of course, always lives together, and yet we come together on the Sabbath. I mean, we're scattered, and I come over here and I want to try to know as much as I can about you or what you're doing, but I'm not always over here. I'm over here often on the weekend. But that's when we can make the most of the time here on the Sabbath day. And yet sometimes our conversations can be about work or school, which would be okay. I mean, those are okay. But maybe even about the trials, whatever it is we're going through, whatever we're sick of, or whatever someone else is going through, those are all very good. Sometimes it's just about the world around us and the political scene that we may discuss, just trying to keep up. And yet it also could be somewhat superficial and not really all that edifying. And so what can we do to change that? So I asked, what kind of thoughtful questions might we ask each other to be better acquainted with others personally? I learned something today that I won't share, but I learned something that I didn't know. Something that I didn't know about someone's past. And that's good. I kind of feel bad. Can we consider asking others questions about their past, about their interests, about their hobbies, about even future plans? We have young people here who are planning their lives. Those are things that would be good to talk about. I mentioned learning something today that I didn't know. I was kind of appalled whenever I went to Mr. Ron Allen's funeral service. And they had a memorial service, and it was a little different. They had it out at the park, and wasn't something that I expected. But I didn't realize he was a veteran. I didn't, they had a flag and some military person there who went through a short ceremony. But I didn't realize that. I knew him for several years, but I didn't know that. And so, can we think of questions that would help kind of disclose a little more personal side of what people have gone through? Kind of know Hank grew up on a farm in Nebraska. He's an old farm boy, maybe long removed from the farm, I guess only at a distance. But here are a few examples of questions that you might want to ask someone at church. I'm going to enumerate a few things as we think about what kind of thoughtful questions could we ask each other and actually learn about each other and know more about each other on a personal level. We might ask, what is something that you wish more people knew about you? What is something that you wish more people knew about you? And again, I can say I know a little bit, but I certainly don't know near as much as I might if I ask these kind of questions of you. Another one would be, and this actually, we were going over this in Kansas City last week, and at the potluck, I think this was maybe a common question among people. What is a favorite or meaningful scripture to you? That of course has to do, we often talk about our calling, we talk about how God brought us into church or what we've been through in the last 10, 20, 50 years. We often talk about that, but what is a favorite or meaningful scripture to you? Another one that people talked quite a bit about last week was what was the most, or what would be the fondest memory that you have of your childhood? I think about my childhood, and I have to say it was incredibly wonderful. I was like I said, a farm kid growing up on a farm. I had all kinds of run of the farm. I enjoyed almost everything that we were doing. I was incredibly favored. I was really favored because of my family situation, my mother dying whenever I was born. And so my dad remarried, and so the woman that I know of as mom was always making me feel good. She didn't want me to feel like I was slighted because with the other kids who would come on later, obviously those are kids that she and Dad had, but didn't want me to feel left out. I surely didn't. It was different, though, having 3 sets of grandparents. That was always interesting for me. That was odd because nobody else had 3 sets of grandparents. I kind of felt bad about that because I didn't really understand it very well. Didn't know it too much, except as I would grow older and into my teens, I could comprehend more about that situation. My birthday's on the 4th of July, as some of you know, and so that's usually a party time situation. It was at our farm, cousins, Dad's relatives from around, and everybody showed up at our house, ice cream, cake, fireworks. For many years I thought, man, this is great. I am just really something. And of course, that wasn't the focus, but it may have been. I mean, I certainly didn't feel slighted in the least. Going to school in a little, very small school, the school that I went to throughout high school, throughout grade school to high school, 1 to 12, the whole thing was together. That's a small town school. I was very familiar with that, familiar with everything that went along out there at the playground and at the school, familiar with all the people, knew who all they were. There were about 10 or probably 12 or 14 of us who went through from grade 1 to grade 12, all 12 years, so we knew each other fairly well. That's not as common if you're in a big school and if you don't have that kind of a relationship. And yet, what are the most fond memories that you have of childhood? Sometimes our childhoods don't have fond memories. Some of them are kind of difficult. Maybe we don't have to focus on those so much. There were problems in my life as well, but that was an important thing. It was an important thing to me for that family setting and the way that things work out. We might also ask, what is one good habit a person should start in their 20s? Some of you aren't quite 20 yet. Some of you are already 20 and beyond. But what would be a good habit? See, those of you who are younger can think about, well, what are some of the things they ought to really ingrain into my life and do? And those of us who are older, we can certainly think back, well, what I should have done was, or, I should have avoided this, or I should have striven to do that. Those are things that might be helpful to each other. What is something that you would want to be reminded of more often? What is something you'd like to be reminded of more often? One of the young people in Kansas City asked me that afterwards. I was saying, I'm having trouble even remembering anything, so I need to be reminded to remember things. I need to be reminded not only to do the things that we all know we should be doing, but to try to think about others. That's something that I would be helpful in doing. What's something you'd like to stop doing by the next Feast of Tabernacles? See, we've got a whole year. We're not even into 2025 yet. The feast is early October next year. What is something that we'd like to stop doing by next feast? Or what is your favorite thing to do in your spare time? If you have spare time, we can work and we can have other activities that we may be involved in, and we have school. For those of you who are younger, that's a necessity, and that's something that should be a high priority for all of you, because that is in a sense a key to opening up many, many other things throughout your life. But, something that you should emphasize, something that you should feel is important. But what would be a favorite thing that you'd like to do in your spare time? I know one thing that I certainly like to do is go to the gym. I like to do that. Some people don't like to do that and they feel like they need to be made to go exercise. I like to do it. I want to do it. I've done it for 50 years. I like to do it. But when I can't do it, that's part of the reason why I'm getting my knees fixed. Because they're wore out, but I want to do it. I want to go and be able to be functional. And actually, I was talking yesterday to a friend up in Leavenworth he's turning 90 next week. I had to find out, what's going on for your big to-do here. And of course, his kids and grandkids and they're all going to be there over the next few days. And then he said, well, what are you doing? And I told him, well, I've got my physical therapy I need to do in order to get ready for this surgery that's a couple of weeks or 4 weeks, more than 4 weeks from now. And so I need to be well, why do you want to fix your leg? How bad is it hurting? I said, well, it's wore out, so I want to fix it because I want to go and do. I want to be able to do. I want to be able to work. I want to be able to go. I want to be able to help and serve Pat. I just want to be able to do it. He said, well, that makes sense. He's a wonderful guy. So what would be a favorite thing you'd like to do in your spare time? What talent do you have that you could share or teach to other people? What talent might you have to share or teach to someone else? Another thing that we could ask, sometimes you might think, well, what could I do for you this coming week? And of course, all of us are mostly pretty separated, so that's somewhat hard to do, although you can do that. But you might ask, well, what might I pray about for you this coming week? See, now those are all questions. And of course, that's only a sample of the millions of questions that people could think of. Now, what kind of thoughtful questions? The point is, a strong family is going to know each other, care about each other, and accept each other for what they bring to the family. See, all of us bring something to the family, to our spiritual grouping here in Fulton. We bring something. And of course, we realize that, trying to follow the example of Jesus and learning to be a servant and learning to have that attitude is what God wants, and we strive to do that, and you all do that quite well. And yet, maybe there's other things we could think about to be able to be more personally acquainted with others. And even, as we have our monthly fellowship meals, those can kind of come and go. Well, maybe we should learn something new if we ask those type of questions. And so I'm simply encouraging us to get to know each other on maybe a deeper level than we would otherwise know. Here in 1 John 4, this of course is again John talking about love. But in 1 John chapter 4, you see a number of verses that of course mention love and talk about how that God is love. He is the ultimate, that's the ultimate trait that you would say, although God is many things. He is holy, He is righteous, He is love. But here in verse 7, 1 John 4:7, he says, "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. And whoever doesn't love does not know God, for God is love." It puts a high priority on being loving toward one another, thinking about trying to become, in a sense, kind of overcome our own kind of inherent selfishness, because that's really what the attitude of the world is. It is based on me first, based on selfishness. But God, of course, is much different than that. Verse 10, "For this is love, not that we love God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins." See, that's what God is. But I also want to point out what it says down here in verse 21. The very last verse in this chapter, 1 John chapter 4, verse 21, "The commandment that we have from Him is this, that those who love God," if we really want to say that we love God, that we are Christian, that we are the people that God wants us to be, that those who love God must love their brethren also. See, that's a big part of what God is wanting us to do. And of course, we might also read here as we conclude in Hebrews chapter 10, Hebrews 10 verse 23. It says, "Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for He who has promised is faithful. And let us consider," in verse 24, "how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the manner of some, but encouraging one another," or exhorting one another, "and all the more as we see the day approaching." See, we read that and we know, yeah, well, we are closer than we were last week and at any time in the past. But we want to exhort one another or encourage one another or uplift one another. And perhaps we can do that thinking about how that is that we are a spiritual family. And we want that family to be strong. And so perhaps we can think about thoughtful questions that can strengthen our spiritual family.